hopefully you guys are familiar, and hopefully you guys are realizing the point of the quizzes is just to give you some extra motivation to read, because this work is way easier. The more familiar you are with the story, the easier the class is. So we're going to try to be familiar with the story and then do close reading every time. So today is 9/5/25. If you're on top of your dates, putting those on there, it's helpful, because it means that when I need your notes later, I can ask you. If I am asking somebody to check notes, or if you know a day is missing, right, it's helpful to have the date. It's also helpful to have them organized by Unit 1, Day 3, which is the Schoology folder where your work will be today. So when you ask me, where is the assignment, where do I find it on Schoology? Unit 1, Day 3, right? You just look at your notes and you know. And then if you're missing, you go, what day did I miss? All right, whichever day you don't have notes for, or you have the date, and you'll easily be able to work from there. So we've got all that, and then helpful notes today. Today's notes, I'm going to give you guys a bunch of just evidence, right? Before I've said these are the objective things. Think of it more as when I lecture, I'm providing evidence. I'm not going to get the conclusion of anywhere. I'm just going to go, here's our evidence. Use it to conclude something, right? Conclude based on this stuff and based on your personal beliefs, whatever that may be. How does this stuff work together to influence the genre of literature you think it falls into? Because again, this is a literature class as much as it is anything else, right? We are hopefully dealing with scripture in a holy manner and taking it seriously, but we are at the same time having to do some literature to get there. So we're going to look at a literary breakdown. As I said, the flood story, we spent like 4 classes or something talking about poetic structures and chiasms, right? Hopefully, we all remember what chiasms are, right? We talked about them a bunch. It's a long poetic device, so it's a way of shaping or framing a story, right? You're going to have to reorganize some things, but it's a poetic device to go from point A inward to something else. So idea A, B, C, D, etc., and then you go backwards out. So it's using parallels. It's using like rhyming ideas rather than rhyming of words to get to a certain point. And what is the point according to this chiastic structure? What is the point of the flood story? If we assume that this is right, this chiastic structure, what is the point? It's that God remembers Noah, right? God remembers is the big operating point in this story. Now, one of the other framing devices we've used, this is our literary breakdown, right? Our structural breakdown of the story. It's important to note that this is one giant chiasm, right? It's set up in a poetic manner. As a story is set up in a poetic manner, it seems that they've done something here. It's not like this perfect of a chiasm just happens in nature, at least not typically, right? It doesn't just happen this perfectly. And hopefully you guys can see this, and then as we read it, you'll notice. It's why this story repeats so much. It is one of the most repetitious stories in the Bible, and it is difficult to read sometimes because of that. But that being said, the point is God remembers us. Now, do we remember the other framing for why and when the Bible was getting redacted and edited together? Does anybody remember that? The redactors, the scribes that put it together. What was happening in their lives when they were doing this? Anybody want to shout it out? Exile. Thank you, Adriel. Yes, exile. So, what is exile? It's a time of intense suffering, right? Why would it be important, do you think, for the authors? Why would they shape the story to be about God remembers us if they're in exile? Yeah, because they feel forgotten, right? That's exactly it. So, exile is framing the story. Exile frames this story. Exile and chaos, all right? Exile, chaos. They're going to want to remember. They're going to want to say, God will remember us, right? They're going to have a story here of chaos. Imagine the chaos of, look how evil the world is. The world is just blindly evil. And then Noah bumps along and has chaos, experiences chaos, and gets reminded about God remembering him, right? God will remember us. Because these people, as they're editing this story together, putting the story down on paper, are starting to go, are we forgotten? In fact, writings from that time that are about that time, there's a book called Lamentations. We'll read that towards the end of the semester together. The whole thing is literally just lamenting or crying out, experiencing sad anger. Yes. Oh, good question. Let's do that later. I'll just sign you out for now. Yeah, I'll sign you out. Thank you. So there's a book called Lamentations, and it's literally just asking God, where are you? Why are you gone? Right? The whole thing. If you didn't know that's in the Bible, it is. It's literally somebody saying, God, I'm so angry. Where have you gone? You must be missing. They literally write in the Bible about God just being gone, which is kind of the point of so much of these things, right? It's feeling forgotten, but wanting to be remembered. All right, here's one of the important things. We're going to go over some words here, some words that we need to focus on and think about, and realize that we all have a different lens that we go to. Right? We have a temptation to read the Bible super literally, especially modern people like to look at it and go, this is historical. That's great. You can absolutely do that. But we have to remember some things about language. The first is when we talk, I'm going to write it on the board so you have this idea. You don't have to write it word for word. When we talk about God, all language, all right, beginning to see why you guys get annoyed that I handwrite things, but I'm going to keep doing it. All language becomes metaphorical. All language becomes metaphorical when we talk about God. I think almost all of us in this room would identify in some way as Christian. Not all of us will, and that's okay. I actually love when students say, I'm not a Christian. If you are confident enough in yourself that you can say, no, I don't hold to that faith, and here's why, great. I want to have that conversation with you. But most of us probably are, right? I'm Protestant. Most of you guys are probably Catholic. There's a good chunk of you guys that are Pentecostal. There's all sorts of other types of Christian in here, right? I don't know what type of Christian you are, but most likely you are, or you definitely know somebody, probably your parents, that are. And so when we talk about God as believers in God, right, as Christian people, and when we look at the Bible authors are doing the same thing. All language becomes metaphorical because the operating belief is that God is completely transcendent. We'll explain that word later. But it's this idea that God is completely above us, right? It's like ant language. Ants, if ants were to describe us, everything that they use would have to be metaphorical from their language because they don't have those concepts and those ideas. They have some of it, and they can get close, but they don't truly know what we are, right? This is how we talk about God, is that language must become, in some ways, metaphorical or using phrases to get at the idea, but it's not going to always aim perfectly. And this is one of the things that we need to appreciate and understand about the humanness of the Bible. See, the Bible, again, as Christians, we believe that it is inspired by God. It's not written, pinned down. God didn't sit down on a stone and pin it down and then throw it down from heaven. God did not capture a human and overcome them and force them to write something. But he inspired it and breathed it out. And then humanity still had some human words, right? Some human ideas here. So there's still a humanness in the Bible. And we need to appreciate this. We're going to walk through it with a few different phrases that are used here. Because we get some of the most human-sounding language to describe God. And the first is God remembers, right? So I want to write down a few possible meanings. And you guys might have other meanings you could ascribe to this word. But for some possible meanings to the word remembers. All right. The first idea and possibility when we're reading this, God actually forgot. All right, who thinks that the word remembers, would necessitate or require that God actually forgot something? This is one possibility, right? God actually forgot. The idea becomes maybe we don't know as much about God as we thought, right? We don't need to write. We'll leave that blank. Maybe one way of reading this, if we're doing a super literal reading of everything is exactly as it says, God remembers would mean God actually forgot. I don't personally love that. I'm going to argue that this is the second one, is that remembers equals acts morally on behalf of. All right. Acts morally on behalf of. That's a weird way of phrasing that. You can phrase it however you want. But he's acting on somebody else's behalf. He's acting in somebody else's moral best interest, right? He's taking a moral action. The word remember here, in this argument and this understanding, is that God is acting on behalf of somebody else. I could say, I remember Sonny's difficulty on quizzes. Or I remember Sonny, and actually, you know what? I'm going to pick on Caleb here. I remember how Caleb is a little bit late to class some days, so I'm going to extend the quiz time, right? I remember Caleb, and so I extend the quiz time. It's not that I had forgotten that, right? It's that I'm acting on his behalf and changing things to help him out. Right? This is this understanding of remembers, and I think we can argue this. Yes. Which one? This one? Yeah, remembers equals, right? It could mean that acts morally on behalf of. So when we see the phrase, so acts, his actions are morally on the behalf of somebody else. He's doing a moral good action on behalf of somebody else. So every time we see the phrase God remembers, and we're going to see it a lot this semester, one of the possible readings is we say God acted morally, right, did a good thing on behalf of Noah. Which I think this is a pretty good reading. This is a really good theological reading. We're kind of taking what we already know and putting it on. Now, another one, I like this one. The author witnesses things. Author describes what it looks like. Like from human perspective. All right. His point of view. All right. Here's what I'll say. All right. The author describes what it looks like from his point of view. What I mean by this is the author doesn't have language for God not taking so long to do something, right? The author doesn't have the language for that. So one of the possible ideas here is that the author describes what it looks like, what they think is happening, right? The author describes what it looks like from his point of view. It looks like God is doing this thing. I'll go back to that in a second. Let's see. All right. The next is the author has incomplete ideas and is giving best metaphor, right? They're struggling, they're trying, they're saying, this is what we think it is, but they don't really know, right? They kind of just go, this is our retelling. This is what we know of God, is that he'll remember us. This is their more hopeful reading. It's slightly different than this third one of God describes what it looks like, right? The author thinks, so with this one, maybe the author thinks this is what's happening, right? This is more the author thinks that God remembered because it looks like that. They've witnessed God do something and go, I think he remembered. Whereas in the fourth one is more like the author knows that this is not quite the best fit, but they're giving the best description they have, right? Now you could probably combine all of these into one common idea. And again, these are not the only ways of understanding this word. These are possibilities that each of us might have that will shape what type of story, what genre we think it falls into. And they'll be shaped by that, right? If I am somebody that is reading a literal historical document and I say, This is a history book. This is precise events. And I'm being consistent in my thoughts, right? I'm not letting metaphor creep in at all. I'm going to have to say God actually forgot this, right? At least if I'm being a consistent thinker. And I hope you guys become consistent thinkers. I'm going to have to say God actually forgot because he remembered, so he must therefore have forgotten. Now, I don't love that. I think this one's pretty good, is that maybe you're going, this is this bias history, this reshaping and telling, because I want you to have a perspective, right? If you are this bias history person where you go, it looks like they've reshaped some of the things in order to tell people something, to get to a conclusion, you're probably going to say, remembers seems to be using the phrase, using it, something archaic, something old, to describe that God is going to morally act on our behalf. Now, could be one of the more mythological readings are going to probably be more like, they described what it looks like, what they thought was happening, but maybe they're kind of wrong, right? This one is, maybe they're a little bit wrong, they're just lacking because they don't understand. And this one is, the author knows that it's not a perfect description, but they're using metaphor anyways, right? Do these kind of make sense as general categories, general things? I see some nods or shaking of heads. Yeah, all right. These are not perfect descriptors. These are not necessary. Maybe there's a better one you have. These are just helpful tools. I also want to say we should apply this to God's regret, right? Does God, all right, anybody, do we think, let's answer this question. Does God make mistakes? No? Why do you say no? Why do you say no that God doesn't make mistakes? He's perfect. All right. Anybody else? Is anyone willing to stand in Bible class at a Christian school and say God makes mistakes? All right. Is anybody in here capable of regretting something that was not a mistake? Does that make sense? I've never heard of somebody regretting something that's not a mistake. At least I haven't. All right. Every time I've made something, I said that was a good choice. I did that. I'm not going to go, I regret doing the right thing. Right? But the Bible says God regrets. The Hebrew word would actually be closer to God repents from it. He turns his mind away, which is tricky. All right. And then in the story, after God regrets it, what is the very next thing God does is he changes his mind. He says, I'm going to destroy all of humanity. And then he changes his mind because Noah proved that he's righteous. This is a tricky thing. And I'm not going to give you the answer because I don't know that there's a good answer. All right? I actually go back and forth on how I answer this. I will say confidently, I don't think God makes mistakes. All right? I'm going to give that, I'm recording this. I want to make sure it's very clear. I'm not saying God makes mistakes, but how we comprehend this word, we have to go to a similar series of thinking here, right? We have to do something similar of, did God actually regret it? Or is regretting just a really good, he's heartbroken by it. Is it a really good descriptor? What is happening with that word? And I'm not going to give you the right answer because I think there's maybe only one wrong answer, and it's the idea that God makes mistakes. But other than that, even that one, I'm okay with you guys. I want to make it very clear. If you're reading this and you're taking the very literalist reading, and you're saying it does seem like maybe God did feel that this was a mistake or believe this is a mistake, that's fine. You can say that in this class. You're not going to get in trouble from me. All right? I'm not going to be mad at you if that's how you choose to read it. I think I'll have a conversation with you about all right, how do we work for this? But that is part of our spiritual development and spiritual growth. So we wrestle with these very difficult things in the Bible. Right? It's a very difficult thing. When we do Midrash later today, and I ask you to creatively rewrite and rethink and kind of argue with the Bible, it's taking the Bible seriously and holy, and it's wrestling with difficult things. It is very hard when you see the Bible say God regretted something. That is difficult. And I want you guys to wrestle with that and struggle. I'm trying to point you at all of these things. These are things we have to take into account, right? Just like we have to take into account when we decide the literary genre, we have to take into account this inherently poetic structure of the story. We have to take into account these words, just like God feeling heartbreak. It literally says God's heart was broken. God is sad. Right? We get such human-sounding words, which is why I say all language becomes metaphorical, right? To some degree, when I say God is heartbroken and sad and regretting and remembering, I'm using some level of metaphor there, right? I'm using some symbolic language to symbolize something. And maybe it's perfect or whatever, but that means we each have some work to do on how we, in turn, interpret this thing. All right, there's our quick theology stuff that we have to get into. Again, I'm not a theology teacher, so I'm not going to tell you how to interpret or utilize this information. I'm going to just tell you the information's in the Bible. Good luck. You guys are 14. You can definitely handle the idea of God regarding things. That's definitely within your intellectual wheelhouse. All right, for obviously reasons that's kind of sarcastic. People literally study these verses for their PhDs. This is high level stuff. Well, you guys can do it anyways. All right, I want to get some background of this stuff. All right, the next thing is that we're going to be introduced to something. I'm going to write 2 words here. Noahic covenant. Covenant is our operating term. Covenant. All right. Does anybody know what a covenant is? You can shout it out. I don't need a raised hand. Just shout it out. Yeah, it's a promise, but specifically a promise with consequence. Promise with consequence. So if I make a covenant with you, I am promising something, and I'm saying if I don't do this or you don't do that, a consequence will happen. Right? There's a consequential. It's a very important thing. And I'm making this promise with you. It's a very serious type of promise. It's not something you break. So the Noahic covenant just means the covenant with Noah. Right? God's covenant with Noah. God's promise to Noah. Promise to provide for him, care for him, protect him. God's covenant with Noah. All right, there's only like 4 of these in the Old Testament. We only get a few of these in the Bible. God doesn't do this a lot. Right? God is not just out here slinging covenants around. It happens very seldom, at least in the scheme of things, right? It's not like God remembers pops up constantly, whereas God made a covenant with somebody not nearly as often, right? Noah, Moses, David. We eventually get the new covenant with Jesus. We don't get a lot of covenants happening here. So when they happen, the Abraham covenant, when they happen, we need to pay attention to them. And the first 2 are going to happen right back to back. So covenants are important. We need to know that word. You're going to be asked about this word a lot throughout the semester, is that these promises, why they matter. All right, the next is that I want to say this. There is a flood story. We've done our theology preemptive work. We're going to do some more literary work. Almost every single culture on earth has a flood story. All right? It is a very important note. It's something that shapes how I interact with this story, is that almost every single culture on earth has a flood story. And to my knowledge, I haven't read every single one, but I've read probably a couple dozen. And the ones that I've read all have a singular family that is wiser than the others, getting saved, and a bunch of people being wiped out. And there's a few traits that are all the same. Right? The Roman one, the one for Greco-Roman culture, is so similar to this one, it's crazy. The Native American one is pretty similar to this one. Right? They all have a wise man that gets saved by a kind God. And they all have this. What does that tell anybody? What does that tell you if every culture, whether they interacted with each other or not, right? Middle Eastern, Native American, Pan-Asian, so all the Asian countries. What does that tell you if every culture has a flood story? Right? There's a common folklore, and maybe it did actually happen, right? It's pretty interesting that they all have one that sounds so similar. So when we're talking about literature stuff, how does every culture have one? How does every culture have one? All right, how does every culture have a flood story? That's a question you should ponder. One possible solution is there was a giant flood. But here's the thing. We can see rock formations. You guys have taken basic earth sciences, right? Some basic science. Do you know how rock formations work, right? Do we all kind of have a grasp on this? Probably as tenuous of a grasp as I do. If we're being honest, it's not very great, but it's just basic enough, is that we can actually see rock formations, we can see sediment layers and things like that, so we can actually tell when floods have happened, as far, or pretty well. And this is a place, I mostly show this because this is just one of the coolest places I've ever been in my whole life. Last year, my wife and I took a road trip. It was like 23 hours in the car to Montana. We went to Glacier National Park. On our way there, we got to go to a different national park. On our way back, we got to go to a place I've been wanting to go my whole life. Since I was younger than you guys, I wanted to go to this place called Badlands National Park. It is one of the coolest places on Earth. It doesn't feel like it's on Earth. Wendigos are said to be there, right? It's said to have Wendigos all through there. If you know what a Wendigo is, that's my favorite, one of my favorite folk characters after Mothman. What's Mothman? I talked about Mothman for like the first 3 class periods. Guys, we know who doesn't pay attention. All right, Wendigos are cool too. But anyways, in Badlands National Park, each of these, can everybody even in the back see these layers here, these lines on the rocks? These are actually sediment layers that happen when you go through the signs. Will say, oh, hundreds of millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years, tens of millions of years, whatever, for each layer, where each one had a giant flood in that area or rainfall or whatever. As the land was reshaped and changed, we can actually observe, just like you see the lines of a tree, we can see how quickly something erodes. So we can go, based on this and the types of rock that it is, and based on the layers, you can see when things happen, right? You can tell floods happened at certain times, and then it was dry for however many thousands of years, and then it was all of this stuff. I don't really understand beyond that, right? But what I know is when you're there, you could literally hold a level and across the whole place. If you were to go down into the valley, these are not mountains, these are actually like valleys. You're actually standing above this when you're there, which is really cool. But you stand above this, and if you walk down into them, because when you're driving around, you get a chance to go down into some of them. And when you go down into it, you could literally hold up a level, and everything across the entire place, as far as you can see, everything is lined up perfectly straight and flat. It's wild. It's just bizarre. It's so cool. There's also prairie dogs and goats running around all over the place. It's really neat. Prairie dogs are super cute. But these are the kind of things that we should see if there's a giant flood, right? So we know, one of our pieces of evidence, every culture has a flood story, so we should expect something like this, right? But also, there's no physical proof of a flood. I'm going to just say this: no visible proof of global flood. Global flood. So what on earth is happening, right? Suddenly our stories are inconsistent with what we can observe. So we can either take it, again, very historically and literally. We could say this is exactly this. Or we can say, well, that's not a science book, right? I've never seen a science book that is read like a poem. And instead of saying I have to reject one to accept the other, we could say, let's wrestle through. This is my argument for why this is maybe more like this bias history or something like this, is because we do actually know Middle East floods. Middle East, so in the land of the Bible, the Middle East floods around, these are super rough estimates, guys. You don't tie yourselves to these dates. 50,000, I think 20,000 and 15,000 BCE. So, very long time ago. But we do see those sediment layers of giant floods that took over most of the Middle East. We see at least 3 of them, probably more. Not all of them were as big, but these are like these giant, massive floods that just kind of happened. We know that they happened, right? So I think when we take this evidence, we can kind of go, there's something happening here that they seem to be retelling a common thing. I like the folklore idea, right? They're retelling some common folklore ideas. But also, we do see something that happened in that area. So maybe the author is still using metaphor, and they're saying the whole world, but for them, that means my area, my region. So we don't actually know. All right, I know there's a lot of confusion. Are we good and confused about which genre we think it might fall into? Or are we all like, yes, it definitely is this one? Anybody? All right. I also could point out how much this connects to the Enuma Elish. This is so similar to Enuma Elish stories, right? They flood everything. All this to say, not quite sure which genre I would say this perfectly falls into. Again, this place is awesome. All right, that being said, we're going to go ahead and stand up, read the whole flood story. So open your Bibles to Genesis